My name is Madeline. I'm 82 years old, and I spent 60 of those years imagining, with unsettling precision, how I would take my sister's life apart, piece by piece, the way she took mine. While most people my age hold warm memories of love, family, laughter, I've clutched something colder. Like a stone pressed into my palm, unyielding through the decades. I built a life. Yes, I married. I raised a son. I baked pies and folded laundry and celebrated birthdays with forced smiles. But behind all that, there was a silent engine always running, anger, and a plan, not one fueled by fire, but by ice, measured, deliberate, slow. I never wanted her to bleed. I wanted her to unravel. This morning, I found her letter. It was wedged between a hospice brochure and an ad for canned soup. I nearly missed it. Just a thin white envelope bent at the corner, barely sealed, like it had been handled too many times before it reached me. The handwriting stopped my breath. I hadn't seen those loops and swirls in nearly 60 years, but my fingers knew them instantly. My knees went soft. I stood in the hallway in my nightgown, heart hammering beneath old cotton, as if the past had rung the doorbell and let itself in. She said she was ill. She didn't ask for forgiveness, just said she was alone now and that I could come if I wanted. That was all. No excuses, no explanations. Just space. I don't know what I expected after 60 years, but it wasn't that. I held the envelope to my chest and stood there so long the sun moved across the floor and warmed the tops of my bare feet. I told myself I didn't care, but I was still holding it an hour later. I walked through the quiet of my house like I was floating, past the kitchen where the kettle had long gone cold, past the old chair where my husband used to read his paper every morning, through the narrow hallway lined with family photos I hadn't dusted in months, and then into the room I hadn't entered in years, the one at the end of the hall where the curtains are never opened and the air smells faintly of cedar and thyme. That's where I keep the chest, oak, heavy, a wedding gift from our father, meant to store linens. I filled it with rage. 312 letters. I counted once during a storm that knocked out the power and made me wonder if the world would end before I ever got the chance to hurt her back. I wrote my first letter the night she married him. The man who once sat on my porch swing and traced my palm with his thumb, swearing he only had eyes for me. The man who disappeared for 2 days and returned with an engagement ring for her. I watched their wedding from behind a pine tree at the edge of the churchyard. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I swallowed it deep and went home to write. And I never stopped. Some of the letters are soaked with bitterness. Others read more like journal entries from a woman unraveling, confused by her own devotion to someone she's supposed to hate. There are letters from when my son was born, how I almost named him after our grandfather, until I remembered she'd already taken that name for her daughter. She never asked me. We made a promise when we were girls, whispering beneath quilts in the dark, that we'd share names if we ever had children. She broke that too. I wrote her every time I hit a wall in life, when my husband lost his job, when my mother died and Mary didn't come to the funeral, saying she had too much on her plate, when my son ran away for a year and I nearly lost my mind from grief and guilt. I wrote her when I found the family quilt in her attic, folded away like something meaningless. The same quilt she once claimed had been lost in a flood. I took it. I didn't tell anyone. I just wrapped it around my shoulders in the dead of winter and dared the silence to say something. And still, through all the rage, through all the betrayals I cataloged like sacred relics, there were moments when I wrote her softly, when I asked her questions I never expected answers to, when I remembered the little girl who once sat beside me on a gravel road, our scraped knees touching, whispering secrets, and daring each other to run away and join the circus. That girl was buried under so many decades of resentment, but she never quite disappeared. I unfolded the first letter today, the oldest one. My hands trembled more from age than emotion, but it felt like holding fire anyway. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink smudged where tears had fallen, though I don't remember crying. I read it silently, mouthing the words, and when I reached the end, I nearly forgot to breathe. I had written something I didn't expect, something I had forgotten I ever felt. I missed her. Even then, even at the height of my fury, I still missed her. I sat there surrounded by ghosts. Those letters, those shadows, all the versions of me that lived and died inside those envelopes, and felt something crack. Not open, not yet, but shift. I didn't know what to do with it. The woman I've been for 60 years wouldn't forgive. She wouldn't go. She would take that letter from Mary and set fire to it, then write one final page to tuck on top of the pile, like the last nail in a coffin. But that woman felt further away than usual. The silence in the room was thick, like breath held too long. Then, suddenly, a clatter from the kitchen snapped me back, just a dish slipping off the drying rack. But for a moment, I thought it was her. As if she had somehow walked into my house, sat down across from me, and waited for me to speak. The fear that washed over me wasn't fear of her. It was fear of what I might say. I didn't pick up the broken dish. I stayed right there, with her letter in my pocket and mine all around me, staring at the chest as if it might speak. I don't know yet if I'll go. I don't know what I'd even say. But after 60 years of silence, the weight of that question feels heavier than ever. And maybe, just maybe, that means it's time. I was 17 the summer Mary turned 16, and we were still sharing a bedroom with 2 mismatched twin beds, peeling wallpaper, and a crack in the ceiling we used to name shapes in before falling asleep. She was always better at seeing things, birds, dragons, faces, where I only saw plaster and shadow. Mary had that gift even then, of turning ordinary moments into something cinematic. When we walked down Main Street, people always looked at her first. Not because she was the prettiest, though she was beautiful, but because she seemed to glow from some secret light, as if she carried a private joke in her pocket, and the rest of the world was dying to be let in on it. I used to think that light belonged to both of us. I don't know when I started realizing it never did. That summer was hot, the kind of heat that made your sheets stick to your skin and lemonade taste like heaven. We both got jobs at the general store, she behind the candy counter, me in dry goods. It was our first taste of independence, of earning our own money, of walking home with coins in our aprons and dreams in our heads. And then one afternoon, he walked in. Robert, tall, quiet, just home from college and helping his uncle with the feed supply business. He was older, 22 maybe, with dark hair and calm eyes that made everything around him feel still. The first time he looked at me, I felt like I'd been seen for the first time in my life. I remember the way he asked if I needed help carrying a box, even though I hadn't said a word. I remember how Mary didn't notice, not at first. We started seeing him more often, at church picnics, town dances, even once in the diner late at night. He'd always talk to me first. I wasn't used to that. People usually smiled at me politely, then turned toward her, like I was the curtain before the show. But Robert listened. He asked about books I liked. He offered to walk me home one evening, and didn't flinch when I said no. He just smiled and said, "Next time," and it made my heart ache in that soft, terrifying way that only first love can. One night, I came home from the library and found Mary sitting on the edge of my bed with a strange look on her face. She said Robert had stopped by the store earlier, that they'd talked for nearly an hour. She said he'd asked if I had a sweetheart. I remember how her voice sounded when she told me. Too casual, too sweet, like honey poured over something sour. I felt a shift then. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. It was more like a flicker of warning, like a sudden breeze through a closed window. Over the next few weeks, Robert began to seem different, colder, distracted. He'd nod to me across the church lawn, but not cross it. Mary said he was busy, that his uncle needed him more at the warehouse. She told me to stop mooning over him, that I was always too serious, too intense. Boys don't like that, she said once, brushing her hair in the mirror. I don't know why, but that sentence gutted me. Then came the dance, the summer social. I wore my blue dress, the one with the lace collar Mama sewed by hand, and spent an hour curling my hair until my arms ached. I felt foolish and glowing, nervous in a way that made my stomach flutter. I stood by the punch bowl, watching the door, waiting, and when he walked in, he didn't look at me. He walked straight to Mary, and she laughed like she'd been waiting for him all along. They danced, all night. He didn't ask me once. The next morning, she placed a single pink rose on my nightstand and said it was from him, that he thought I looked lovely. I nodded and said nothing, but that was the first moment I knew something had broken. And not just between him and me, but between her and me. It was quiet, invisible to the world, but I felt it echo in my chest like a dropped glass on tile. The following Sunday, I overheard our mother talking on the phone in the kitchen, her voice tight and strange. Mary had told her that Robert was serious about her, that he might propose. I stood in the hallway, barefoot, gripping the stair rail like it might hold me up, and suddenly I understood. It wasn't that he changed his mind. It wasn't fate. Mary had taken him, quietly, deliberately, like everything else, with a smile on her lips and no remorse in her eyes. I never confronted her. I couldn't. She would have laughed, or cried, or turned it into some joke I wasn't in on. So instead, I waited until she left for the market. Then I opened her jewelry box and snapped the little ballerina off the lid. It was petty and cruel, but I needed something to feel broken that wasn't just me. Later that night, I wrote the first letter. I tore it up, wrote a second one, folded it carefully, addressed it, then tucked it into the bottom drawer of my dresser. I told myself I'd send it when the time was right, when the rage was sharp enough to carve. But I never did. The next week, they announced their engagement, and the part of me that still believed she loved me, that we were still us, shriveled like a flower left out in frost. No one saw it happen. To the rest of the world, we were sisters, beautiful and close, smiling in photographs with arms wrapped around each other. But something essential had gone dark inside me, and I think she knew it. I think she smiled anyway. That summer, I learned something no 17-year-old should have to learn. That love isn't always stolen in grand romantic acts. Sometimes it's taken quietly, like silverware missing one piece at a time, until you look down and realize the table's been set for someone else entirely. Years slipped by like water through cupped hands, and though I built a life far from the town, where Mary's name still rang out in church bulletins and bake sale flyers, her shadow followed me everywhere, in the quiet hours of the morning when the house was too still, in the faces of women I passed who looked just enough like her to make my chest tighten, in the way I smiled at my own son, and sometimes wondered if he would grow up to be kind, or clever, or cruel. I raised him with the kind of love I never received, the kind that left no room for selfishness, and yet deep down, a part of me always feared that the darkness I carried, the bitterness, the thirst for justice, might leak into him anyway, as if pain were something genetic, something passed from mother to child like bone structure or eye color. Then, one unremarkable October afternoon, as golden leaves floated down outside the kitchen window and the radio hummed with some old folk tune I wasn't really hearing, I received a phone call from Fran, an old classmate we hadn't seen in decades but who still lived in town and somehow managed to know everyone's business. She worked in real estate now and mentioned, almost casually, that Mary and her husband were refinancing their house, the big colonial with the green shutters and wraparound porch where they hosted garden parties and posed for picture-perfect holiday cards. Something in her voice made me ask a question I hadn't meant to ask, and when she told me that Mary's name had never been added to the deed, that it had always been in his name alone, I felt a slow, deliberate chill bloom beneath my ribs, a bloom not of sorrow, but of opportunity. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after my son had gone to bed, the soft ticking of the clock almost too loud in the silence, and I pulled out a battered file box from the back of the closet, the one where I kept old letters, property records, forgotten legal papers, and, most importantly, the original draft of our father's will, the one Mary never knew I had. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, just different enough from the final version she filed after his death. The version she claimed had been dictated when he was no longer fully coherent. My hands trembled not with rage, but with clarity, a slow, precise resolve that settled over me like frost. I could challenge her ownership of the house. I could use that discrepancy to file a legal claim, reopen the estate, draw her into a web of questions and forms and investigations that would shake her peace in ways she'd never anticipate. It wouldn't even need to be public. A few letters from a lawyer, a few weeks of doubt and paperwork, and she'd be forced to justify the life she'd so comfortably built on top of everything she took from me. I met with an attorney in a small office downtown, a man with kind eyes and coffee-stained teeth, who reviewed the documents and said, yes, there was a case, not a strong one, but just enough gray to move things forward, enough to make her sweat. to remind her that nothing is ever truly secure. I left his office with a manila folder in my hands and a weight in my chest that felt strangely satisfying, like holding something warm on a cold day, a secret that pulsed with its own heartbeat. But that night, as I prepared the final packet, I came across a smaller envelope buried beneath the rest, a letter I had never opened, one Mary had sent nearly 20 years earlier after our father passed, which I had refused to read out of principle, folding it instead into the past like a splinter I wasn't ready to remove. Something made me open it. Not forgiveness, not curiosity, but maybe just exhaustion. Inside was no apology, no excuses, just a photograph. It was us, on the porch steps of our childhood home, barefoot and sunburned, laughing over something lost to time, with grape juice stains on our lips and scraped knees pressed side by side. On the back, in her unmistakable handwriting, barely legible as though erased and rewritten too many times, were the words I hadn't expected. Please remember who we once were. And in that moment, everything inside me shuddered, not crumbled, not collapsed, just shifted. I sat there for hours, the legal file open beside me, the photo in my lap, my thoughts pacing like a wild animal trapped inside the walls of my own heart. I had spent so many years preparing to strike that I no longer knew what it would feel like to stop. And the strangest part was how unfamiliar the silence felt without anger humming beneath it. The next morning, I walked back to the lawyer's office, folder in hand, heart full of questions I couldn't name. I sat in the chair across from him, looked at the paper I had signed the day before, and told him not to file it. He blinked, surprised, but not offended, and asked if I was sure. I said nothing. I just gathered my things, thanked him politely, and stepped out into the bright, indifferent light of an early autumn morning. I wandered the streets for an hour, lost not in location, but in identity, stopping finally at a bench near the park, where children played and leaves chased each other in the wind. A man sat beside me feeding squirrels with a paper bag in his lap, humming a tune I half recognized, and after a while, without looking at me, he asked if I was all right. I nodded, because what else could I say? That I had almost taken revenge, and it hadn't felt like victory, only vacancy? That evening, I returned home, opened the chest at the foot of my bed, and pulled out letter number 176. I wrote down everything: the call, the documents, the plan, the photo, the pause. And then I folded that letter and tucked it into the box with the rest. Still unsent, still unanswered. Because maybe some stories don't need to be told in courtrooms or arguments or shattered dreams. Maybe some are meant to live quietly, where no one sees them, but they change you all the same. I thought, if I couldn't take her house, I could still take her peace. Something quieter than courtrooms and paper trails, something that wouldn't leave fingerprints, but would settle into the cracks of her life like water before the freeze. She had always cared more about image than truth, always knew how to polish a lie into something people could hang on their walls. So I decided, if she built her life like a house of mirrors, then I would scatter a few well-placed stones. I didn't need anyone to hate her. I just needed them to wonder. It started with a story, slipped like honey into a conversation with an old neighbor I hadn't seen in years, a woman who still wore lipstick to the grocery store and collected town gossip like it was a form of charity work. I ran into her on purpose, just outside the pharmacy where she liked to linger. I mentioned Mary's husband, how he looked tired lately, how distance had grown between them. I said I didn't want to speculate, but that I hoped they were all right. She raised her eyebrows just enough for me to know I'd planted something. The seed didn't need sunlight. It would grow all on its own. Then came the whispers about the family business, about a transaction from years ago that didn't quite add up, about a small inheritance that was never fully explained. I didn't lie. I simply asked questions, asked them in the right places, to the right people, in the right tones. And as the days passed, I watched it spread, like steam across glass, subtle but inevitable. People began to look at her with softened smiles, the kind that hide suspicion. And I thought, this is what it feels like to finally be heard without speaking too loud. But then something happened that I wasn't prepared for. One afternoon, I passed by the community garden where she volunteered, not because I meant to, but because some part of me had started circling her life the way people circle a wound, drawn to what hurts. I stood behind the gate, far enough to not be seen, and watched her kneel in the dirt beside a little girl, showing her how to plant seeds in the soft earth. Mary's hair had gone gray, thinner than I remembered, and her hands looked more fragile than I imagined. But her face, it was calm, not smug, not triumphant, just quiet, present. The girl laughed and said something I couldn't hear, and Mary touched her cheek with the back of her fingers the way our mother used to do. And in that moment, I felt something sharp and terrifying. Not anger, not sorrow, but guilt, hot and sudden like a fever. I stood there frozen, holding on to the iron gate, and realized I had spent so long defining her by one chapter that I forgot she had kept living, had kept growing, had built something beyond the wreckage she left behind in me. Later that week, someone slipped a note under my door. No name, just one sentence, written in careful, slanted letters. Your sister brings soup to the hospice on Wednesdays. I thought you should know. I sat with that sentence for hours, reading it over and over like it might change, like the letters might rearrange into something I could justify hating. But they didn't, and the truth of it cracked something in me that had held for decades. The next Wednesday, I went. I told myself it was just to see, just to confirm. I waited outside, watched her walk up the steps carrying a pot wrapped in a towel, her breath visible in the crisp afternoon air. She smiled at the nurse who opened the door, and when a patient in a wheelchair waved from the hallway, Mary bent down and kissed the woman's cheek like they'd known each other a lifetime. I couldn't move. I stood across the street for nearly half an hour, hidden behind the shade of an old oak, my hands trembling, not with hatred, but with the terrible, choking question I didn't want to ask. What if she had changed? When I got home, I didn't write a letter. I didn't open the chest. I just sat in the dark kitchen with my coat still on and my gloves in my lap, wondering if I had spent 60 years trying to destroy a woman who no longer existed. And worse, wondering if I had let that same woman destroy everything soft that was ever left in me. After everything I'd seen, after watching her kneel in the dirt with that little girl and press soup into the hands of dying strangers with a tenderness I hadn't imagined her capable of, I should have let the past dissolve quietly, should have accepted that maybe the person she was now no longer matched the shadow I'd been fighting for 6 decades. But instead, I found myself staring at an envelope I had no business opening, the one tucked behind old deeds and birth certificates in the back of my drawer, the one written by our mother before her stroke, shaky and half-finished, but potent in the way only a dying woman's honesty can be. The letter wasn't addressed and had never been shared, but the words lingered like a bruise. She had written that Mary was impulsive, too quick to take and slow to reflect, that she worried Mary had inherited our father's charm, but not his loyalty. And even though she didn't say it outright, I could feel the weight behind the silence that followed, as if she wanted me to be careful. Or perhaps she wanted me to forgive her for loving us unequally without ever saying she had. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next. Maybe it was the way that guilt had started creeping under my skin like cold air through an old window frame. Or maybe it was the sudden realization that if I didn't act now, the moment might pass and take my last chance for control with it. But I took that letter and rewrote it, tracing our mother's hand until it felt like second nature, until I could recreate every curl of her script and every pause between words as if it were a song I'd memorized in childhood. I softened some phrases, darkened others, made sure it looked like something Mama might have written on her final lucid afternoon, something meant to be found in a drawer or tucked into a Bible, private and devastating in equal measure. And when it was done, I folded it carefully, sealed it in pale blue stationery I knew Mary would recognize, and wrote her name in faded ink, adding just enough wear to make it look like time had hidden it rather than me. I didn't send it through the mail. Instead, I drove across town just before dawn, parked 2 blocks away, and crept up her porch steps like a thief, heart pounding, fingers numb, ears sharp to every sound, and placed the envelope in a small linen bundle on her welcome mat, tied with twine like it had been wrapped in 1967 and forgotten ever since. And then I walked away fast, not looking back, because part of me was afraid I might feel something other than triumph. For the rest of that day, I couldn't sit still. I cleaned the same countertop 5 times, left the television running without sound, kept imagining her face as she opened it, the flicker of recognition, the confusion, the ache, and I pictured her hands trembling the way mine had when I first read the original draft, only this time she would feel exposed, judged, maybe even abandoned by a mother who died loving her, but not trusting her. But the days passed, and nothing came. No phone call, no confrontation, no ripple through our small town's gossip chain. It was as if the letter had disappeared into silence, and for a moment I wondered if she'd recognized it for what it was, a forgery, and simply chosen not to respond. I told myself that would be worse than any other reaction, but I was wrong, because on the 5th day, her letter arrived. It was quiet, steady, and devastating in its restraint. Not a word about the envelope I had planted, no accusation, no trembling hurt or fury. Only a few paragraphs written with the kind of softness that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, but simply exists like a door left open at twilight. She said she wasn't writing in hopes of forgiveness, and she wasn't trying to heal old wounds because some things scar too deeply to be smoothed away with apologies. But she wanted me to know that even if I never spoke to her again, she still lit a candle for me every week, still thought of me when the weather changed, and still remembered the way we used to laugh until our stomachs hurt, back when we were girls who thought we'd always be on the same side. There was something terrifying in that letter, not because it was manipulative, not because it was designed to break me, but because it wasn't trying to do anything at all. It just existed, without demand, without expectation, and somehow that made it harder to hold than all the rage I'd kept bottled for 6 decades. I dropped it on the kitchen table and backed away like it had burned me, and then I sat there in silence, unable to move, because for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was still the injured party or the one doing the wounding. I stayed up all night. Lights dimmed low. The letter unfolded beside my cold cup of tea, and every time I tried to justify what I had done, I heard her words again, not the ones she wrote, but the ones she didn't, the grace between the sentences, the absence of retaliation, and it hit me with a force I wasn't ready for, that maybe she had changed, maybe she had grown, and I was the one still stuck in the past, clutching a version of her that no longer existed, so I wouldn't have to face the one I had become in return. I didn't open the chest that night. I didn't write another letter. I just sat there, hands wrapped around nothing, surrounded by shadows that didn't speak but also didn't leave, and wondered what kind of woman I would have been if I had let go sooner. I had told myself for decades that if I ever saw her again, it would be on my terms, that I'd walk through her front door wearing every year of silence like armor, speak calmly while she withered beneath the weight of everything she'd done, and leave before she could speak a word I hadn't already heard in my mind 1,000 times. But the truth is, when the moment finally arrived, it didn't feel like power at all. It felt like drowning, like being pulled into a current I had spent my whole life pretending I could control. And the envelope I now held in my hand, the second one she'd sent in less than a month, was so soft and light that it made me shake with how heavy it made everything else. There was no long message this time, just a date and a short line in her careful script. She said she would be home, that she wouldn't call again, that she understood if I chose silence, but she would sit on the back porch that Sunday with a second cup of tea, just in case. I stared at that line until the sun shifted through the curtains and spilled across my lap, and I felt like I had aged another year, just trying to decide whether I could survive seeing her face again, not because I couldn't handle her, but because I wasn't sure who I'd be if I let myself soften, if I looked into her eyes and saw someone human instead of the villain I had needed her to be all these years. The drive was only 3 hours, but it felt longer, stretched by the weight of too many imagined versions of how this would go. In some she cried and begged. In others, I stayed cold and untouched. And in one strange version I couldn't stop thinking about, she just smiled and said nothing. And I broke first. I hadn't been back to that town in over 30 years, and as I passed familiar mile markers and grocery stores that had changed names but not shapes, I kept seeing ghosts. 2 girls riding their bikes barefoot through gravel roads, a teenager crying behind a tree, while a wedding song played from across the field. A young woman pressing her face against a motel window, wondering if her mother would forgive her for not coming home for the funeral. I didn't stop. I didn't play music. I just drove in silence, hands clenched on the wheel, every muscle braced for a collision that might only happen inside me. When I pulled up to the house, nothing had changed. The trellis still leaned slightly to the left. The paint on the shutters was peeling, just like it used to, and the same wind chimes Mama bought from the church bazaar still hung under the eaves, clinking softly in the breeze as if no time had passed at all. For a moment, I couldn't get out of the car. My fingers stayed frozen around the steering wheel, and my eyes burned with a heat I didn't understand because I had spent 60 years preparing for this and still felt utterly, completely unready. Then I saw her on the porch, sitting in that old rocking chair that used to creak under Daddy's weight, her hands wrapped around a blue ceramic mug, her back slightly hunched, but her eyes locked on mine the moment I stepped out. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just sat there, as if she knew anything more would push me back into the car. And somehow, that stillness broke something in me more than any apology could. I walked up the steps slowly, each one heavier than the last, and when I reached the top, she stood up, carefully, like someone whose body didn't move the way it used to, and nodded once, not in greeting, but in recognition, like we were two women who had lived through a war neither had won, but both had survived. She gestured to the second chair beside her, the one with the thinner cushion, and I sat without a word, afraid that if I spoke, the wrong thing would come out first. The tea was still warm. Jasmine. I hadn't smelled it in years, but the moment it reached my nose, I was 20 again, lying in bed with a fever while she read me magazines and tried to make me laugh. We sat like that for a long time, just breathing in the same air for the first time in a lifetime, and it felt both unbearable and necessary, like watching someone else's life while knowing it had once been your own. And then, without turning her head, she said softly that she hadn't known how much I was hurting. Not really, not the way it turned out to be. And that sometimes when you're young, you think survival means pretending nothing hurts, even if it means stepping over the people you love. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice, but I held the teacup tighter and stared at the garden she'd built, the one with wild lavender and crooked stepping stones, and wondered if maybe she hadn't known how to love back then, but maybe she had learned. I still don't know what made me come. Maybe I was tired of being angry, or maybe I was afraid I'd run out of time before she did. But in that hour on her porch, listening to wind chimes and bird song and the rustle of tea against porcelain, I realized I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet, but I might finally be ready to understand her. After that afternoon on her porch, something in me began to unravel, slowly and almost without sound, like a seam hidden deep in an old dress that starts to give way when you sit down a little too hard. And though I told myself nothing had really changed, that I still had every right to feel what I felt, the truth was I could no longer move through my days without sensing her presence, like a low hum in the walls, not loud, not demanding, just constant. I caught myself staring at old photographs I had stuffed in a drawer years ago, not looking at her, but at the space between us, wondering how two girls who once shared secrets under blankets had grown into women who couldn't share the same air without choking on it. I didn't expect anything more from her. I thought we had reached our unspoken truce, fragile, unsatisfying, but real. So when the thick envelope arrived on a quiet Friday afternoon, it felt like something shifting again beneath my feet, the way the earth sometimes moves when a storm is still too far to hear. Her handwriting was careful, familiar in a way that made my hands tremble before I even broke the seal. And though I didn't open it right away, I knew it wasn't another polite note or vague gesture. It was heavier, deliberate, final in a way I didn't yet understand. When I finally opened it, the first thing I saw was my own voice, words I had written in ink and in fury decades ago, words I thought I had destroyed. Some were typed, others scribbled, but all of them were mine. Letters I had written in the dark, in heartbreak, in silence, and then torn up, burned or thrown away because I couldn't let them exist without also admitting how much power they still held. Somehow, she had them. Not all, but enough. Enough to make me feel stripped bare, seen in a way I never gave permission for. I wondered if someone had saved them without telling me, maybe my husband, maybe my son, or if Mary had quietly gathered them over time, piece by painful piece, like someone collecting fragments of a vase she once shattered with her own hands. I was so stunned, I didn't even realize I was shaking until a page slipped from my fingers and floated to the floor, where the cat pawed it like it was nothing more than a bit of trash. I leaned down to grab it and felt something pull in my lower back, sharp and mean, and I sank to the floor with it. The letter clutched against my chest like it could stop whatever was breaking open inside me. That's when I noticed her handwriting. It wasn't on top, but at the bottom of every page. Quiet, careful responses. Not apologies, not explanations, just sentences, just truths. Under the one where I told her I watched her wedding from the trees and wished the church would collapse, she wrote, "You should have been the one in white." Beneath the letter where I accused her of taking our mother's love like it was owed to her and not earned, she had written, "I never understood what she gave me that she didn't give you, and I still don't." But it was the page I almost didn't recognize, one I barely remembered writing, that stopped me cold. It was the year my son disappeared, when I blamed her not with logic, but with desperation, writing that she had poisoned our bloodline, that everything she touched cracked eventually. I had written that maybe we were cursed, and it started with her. Underneath, she had added, "My daughter didn't speak to me for 5 years. I begged every birthday and she never answered. I think I earned that silence." I didn't cry. Not at first. I just sat there on the floor, surrounded by the pages of my own grief, and felt my heart thudding too hard against my ribs. Not from emotion, but from fear. Fear that I wasn't the only one who'd been hurting all this time. Fear that I had built an entire life around a story that no longer wanted to be true. Then the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was a sales call, but something made me reach for it. It was her voice. Software fragile. And then something I hadn't expected. A pause. Not the kind that waits for permission, but the kind that warns you something is about to break. She said she hadn't meant for me to read the letters that way, that she only sent them because she didn't want me to think I'd shouted into a void all those years. That she had heard every word, even the ones I never sent, and they had followed her too, into her kitchen, into her sleep, into the way she looked at her own children when they fought over nothing but wouldn't let go. She said that even if I never forgave her, she had to stop pretending she hadn't caused damage, because not naming it had turned her into a woman she no longer recognized. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat burned with too many things. I wanted to scream at her, to say it wasn't fair that she got to heal without me. But I also wanted to ask her if she remembered the way we used to fall asleep, with our backs pressed together, believing nothing bad could find us as long as we didn't turn away. After she hung up, I stayed there on the floor until the light through the window shifted from gold to gray and the air turned colder, and my body finally stopped trembling. I gathered the letters slowly, gently, like artifacts I no longer wanted to destroy, and set them back in the envelope. I didn't burn them. I didn't hide them. I just placed them on the mantel, right where the missing photograph used to hang, and for the first time in 60 years, I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop losing. The road to her house felt shorter this time, though I drove slower than usual, as if my body knew this wasn't a visit to finish something, but to begin again, carefully, quietly, with hands that had only just learned how to unclench. I didn't pack a suitcase, didn't bring the letters, didn't even wear the earrings Mama gave me that I used to save for moments when I needed strength. I brought nothing except myself, thinner now, softer in ways I hadn't allowed before, and ready, not to fix the past, but to finally sit beside it without turning away. She was waiting on the back steps, the same ones we used to sit on as girls, while eating cherries and spitting pits into the garden. Her hair was whiter now, pulled back in a low bun that revealed every line time had carved into her skin. But her eyes, those were the same, tired maybe, but still searching, still open. She didn't wave, didn't call my name, just watched as I stepped out of the car and crossed the yard with slow, careful steps like I was walking through glass. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. The distance between us had already begun to collapse, not with grand gestures, but with the kind of quiet presence only two people who've hurt each other deeply can offer. She gestured to the bench beneath the old willow tree, the one that had outlived every dog we ever owned, and we sat there in the filtered light, listening to the breeze move through the leaves like breath through lungs that had just begun to heal. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, lived in, like the air between two people who had finally stopped lying to themselves. I watched her hands. They trembled a little now, and I remembered how those same hands used to braid my hair before school, how they once held my broken wrist steady after I fell off the hay cart, how they wrote me a note in 10th grade when I wanted to skip school but couldn't bring myself to lie to Mama. I realized then how strange it was that something so familiar could become foreign, and how frightening it is when you finally remember why you once loved the person you've spent most of your life trying to hate. She spoke first, not with anything rehearsed, but with a breath that sounded like it had waited 50 years to be released. She told me she had carried shame, not just for what she did, but for how long she let my silence tell the story. She said she always wondered if I'd ever let her speak, and if she deserved to be heard. That line cracked something open in me, because the truth was, I had made her a villain, so I didn't have to examine the parts of myself that were too tired to heal, too proud to reach out, too afraid of what I might find if I let go of the pain I had built my identity around. When I finally spoke, I told her what I never thought I would say, that I didn't know if I forgave her, but I no longer wanted to keep hating her, just to feel like I mattered. I told her that I missed us, not the people we became, but the girls we were, the way we used to talk in the dark about how we'd grow old together and never marry boring men. She laughed then, quietly, and said she'd married a boring man, but he'd made her soup every Sunday until the day he died, and maybe that was enough. We both laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it felt like something two sisters would laugh about, and it was the first moment in years that didn't feel haunted. Before I left, she handed me a small box. Inside was the photograph I had seen before, us on the porch steps, barefoot, happy and unaware that the world would one day twist us apart. But there was something else too, a note. It was in my own handwriting, dated 59 years ago, the year after her wedding, and I had no memory of writing it, but it was mine. The letter was short. I had written that no matter what happened, I hoped she never forgot how deeply I once loved her. I sat with that line for a long time after I returned home, holding the paper like it was the last fragile thread connecting me to the version of myself I thought had long been buried. That night, I didn't write another letter. I didn't open the chest. Instead, I took the box of old letters, the ones filled with rage, sorrow, bitterness, and set it on the dining table. I lit a candle, made myself tea, and read a few of them out loud, not to punish, not to remember, but to finally let them pass through me one last time. And then, quietly, deliberately, I packed them away for good. Not burned, not thrown out, just folded, sealed, and placed in the attic. Not because I needed to hide them, but because they no longer needed to live beside me. And now, I sit in the same chair I've sat in for years, wrapped in the quilt I once took from her out of spite, feeling the weight of 60 years slowly lifting, not vanishing, but no longer holding me down. I am not who I was, neither is she. And that's the most painful, beautiful part of this story, that you can lose something for a lifetime and still find pieces of it in the quiet, if you're brave enough to stop speaking and start listening. So to you, listening now, maybe you've carried something like this too. Maybe you've written 1,000 letters in your head and never mailed a single one. Maybe there's someone you promised never to forgive. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I'll ask you gently, woman to woman, heart to heart, how long will you carry it before you ask yourself who it's really hurting? And maybe, just maybe, they're carrying it too. Tell me in the comments if you've ever sent a letter you never thought you would, or if you're still holding it.